Today we are going to practice problem solving with volume. We already know that volume is the amount of space a 3D object takes up, or how much space is inside of a 3D object. We also know that to find volume, we use volume equals length times width times height. Our formula is V equals L times W times H. So far, we have practiced when we are given the length, the width, and the height, and we have to multiply those three to find us the volume. Today, we are going to have the volume, but be missing one of our other distances. So for example, maybe we're missing height, but we have our volume. So we need to figure out, instead of our volume, now we need to figure out our height. Or we might need to figure out what our length is. So we're going to practice that today. But before we do that, I want to review. We know that when we multiply 3 times 6, it'll equal 18. We can take that and move around those numbers and use an inverse operation. So if we multiply, we can then divide and say, okay, well, 18 divided by 3 is 6. Sometimes we might have a missing number. So it would say 3 times what equals 18. Well, I can think about that two different ways. And I can say 3 times what equals 18. Well, I know automatically that that's 6, but maybe I don't know that. And I can say, okay, 18, inverse that to division. 18 divided by 3 equals what? 6. So we can use that multiplication knowledge or we can use that division. Same thing here. 5 times 7 equals 35. If I move those around and inverse, I've got 35 divided by 7 equals 5. This is written just a little bit differently. 7 times what equals 35? Well, 7 times 5. I can figure out that multiplication in my head, or I can inverse and say 35 divided by 7 equals 5. It's the same thing here, but it looks a little differently. Instead, I have a dot as my multiplication sign. 4 times 8 is 32. 32 divided by 4 is 8. Here, as we move up in our grade levels, instead of having that blank space, we're going to have this letter here, and that letter is called our variable. When we are talking about volume, the H would stand for height. So I can still do the same thing. I can say 4 times what equals 32, or I can say 32 divided by 4 equals what? In this case, when I have that variable, instead I would write H equals 8. Let's try one more of those. 5 times 12 is 60. If I move those around, 60 divided by 12 is 5. Now I have 12 times W equals 60. W in our volume formula would be width. So 12 times what equals 60, or 60 divided by 12 equals what? And again, I write W equals 5 as my answer. So let's get started. If I go down, it says, determine the volume of the missing side of the figure below if the volume of the object is 64 cubic inches. So I have my volume already. What I'm missing is my height. Instead of having a number here, I have the letter H. So I set up the same way I've been setting up before. Volume equals length times width times height. I already know my volume is 64 cubic inches, so I plug that in. Then I go ahead and say, okay, my length is 8, my width is 4, and my height right now is just H. I don't know. Once I'm here and I have everything filled in except for 1, I go ahead and simplify down. 8 times 4 is 32. 64 stays the same. And then I need to bring down my multiplying by H. Now I have two ways to think about it. I can say, okay, and flip this around and say 64 divided by 32 equals what? Well, 64 divided by 32 equals 2. Or option number 2 is to say, well, 32 times what equals 64. And I would still get 2 as my answer. So in the end, H equals 2 inches. Now to check my work, I can go ahead and plug that back in and say, all right, volume equals length times width times height. Well, I've got 8 times 4 times my new height, which is 2. That does in fact equal 64. 4 times 2 is 8. 8 times 8 is 64. And there we have our missing side.